Today, we're going to look at Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin. He was accused of blasphemy. Does the charge hold up? Well, I'll let you decide. Before we get into that story, I want to take you into the book of Exodus so that we can see what Moses was up to around, I don't know, 1500 BC. Let's look at the book of Exodus, and we find Moses out tending his flock. He comes across a bush that's burning, and yet it isn't. The bush is clearly on fire, and yet it's not consumed by the flames. What's going on? Well, Moses is curious, and so he approaches the bush. And from the bush, God speaks and says, "You are on sacred ground. Remove your sandals." And so he does. God tells him that he wants him to go back to Egypt and lead his people out of Egypt so that they won't have to be slaves. And Moses, he's kind of trying to deny things. He says, "Well, Lord, who is sending me?" Which God was it that was sending Moses to free the people? Because, at the time, the Hebrew people believed in multiple gods. The Egyptians had their gods, the Canaanites had their gods, the Midianites, where Moses was living, had their gods. Who was this God that was sending Moses back to Egypt? And so God identified himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Well, Moses knew his ancestry. That narrowed it down considerably. And then God said something a little surprising, something that he had never told Abraham. He said, "I am who am. Tell the Hebrew people that I am sent you to them." Well, that was kind of confusing, I would think. I am, isn't that kind of a funny name? I am who am. God is named I am. I exist. More than anything else, God exists. I am who am. I am the one that exists. That's where we get the idea of Yahweh and even Jehovah. They're both driven from I am who am. The name of God. Okay, now having that under our belts, we can move on. But we can't quite move on to the main story of today just yet. We have to have a little bit more backstory. Do you know what blasphemy is? Let's make sure that you do. Blasphemy is when you are insulting to God. Blasphemy is when you disrespect God. And an appropriate response to blasphemy is to tear your clothing. That's a sign of mourning. And now we're ready to hear the story as it is in the Gospel of Mark. I'll invite you to come with me into the Gospel of Mark and take a look at the story. Jesus was out in the Garden of Gethsemane, minding his own business, when the temple guards showed up and took him away. They took him to stand trial before the Sanhedrin. Now, this was a very peculiar trial that the Sanhedrin was putting on because they were conducting it in the middle of the night. That's not normal. They were kind of cutting corners because it was very important for them to get Jesus put to death. Not only did they have this kind of sham trial in the middle of the night, but they gathered up witnesses to testify against Jesus. They coached them, and yet none of the testimony lined up. What the people were saying, they didn't agree with each other. And so the testimony couldn't be used. Well, finally, the high priest, who had been sitting on the judgment seat, had had enough. He stood up as a way of asserting himself, and he said, "Tell me, are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Now, to be clear, he was not asking two different questions because the Messiah and the Son of God were the same person. It's true that Messiah has more than one meaning in how the Jews at the time were looking at it. But Caiaphas said the Messiah, and that really only had one meaning. If you were narrowing it down to one specific Messiah, the Messiah, well, That was clear. And then the Son of God. Well, there's two different ways to look at the Son of God. One of them is a holy man, someone who's dedicated themselves to God, so much so that they are associated with God. The other way is that the Son of God is the king. If you look at Psalm 2, you see that the king, when he is anointed king, is adopted into God's family, and so the king is called the Son of God. Well, it seems clear from the context that that's the way that the high priest meant it. Are you the Messiah, comma, the Son of God? Well, he wasn't asking two questions. He was asking the same question, just making sure that it was clear by stating it in two different ways. And so, if I can clarify, are you the Messiah, comma, the Messiah? Well, finally, Jesus, who had been rather quiet up to this point, he said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds and seated at the right hand of the Father. Well, at that point, Caiaphas said, you've heard the blasphemy. And he tore his robes, and he said, having heard it, do you agree with me? We have no more need for witnesses. This man needs to be put to death. And they all agreed that he needed to be put to death. Well, it doesn't seem real obvious where the blasphemy is. What exactly did Jesus say that got him executed? Was it that he agreed that he was the Messiah? Well, that hardly seems like blasphemy. And the Son of God works the same way. Since the Son of God is the Messiah, if you're claiming to be the Messiah and you're not, then they would probably say, well, this person is having problems. We need to tend to this. If Jesus were claiming to be a holy man instead, that's even less of a bold statement. There were lots of holy men and women running around in Judea at the time. It was not an extraordinary claim. That would not have gotten him executed. And then he started talking about the Son of Man thing. And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Now notice, Jesus did not identify himself as the Son of Man. They may have speculated that he was talking about himself, but he didn't overtly say that. And then he said that you would see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God. Well, these are expected images. It was expected that the Son of Man would come on the clouds of heaven. It was expected that the Son of Man would be seated at the right hand of God. And so if you say, hey, these expected things are going to happen, that's not blasphemy either. But Caiaphas tore his robe and said, you've heard the blasphemy. Now, granted, Caiaphas was looking for an excuse to put Jesus to death. Any little excuse will do. But Jesus claiming he was the Messiah was not grounds for execution. So what was it? Well, back to the reading that we looked at first. Caiaphas heard Jesus say, I am. Are you the Messiah? I am. Well, Caiaphas heard that as Jesus claiming to be God. And it's funny, because, Jesus didn't have to mean it that way. He could have just been agreeing with Caiaphas. But then you'd think he would have said something like, oh, wait, no, you misunderstood me. All I was saying is I agree that I'm the Messiah. I'm not claiming to be God. But he didn't do that. He didn't disagree with Caiaphas when he claimed he heard blasphemy. He didn't disagree with Caiaphas when Caiaphas tore his robes. He didn't disagree with the Sanhedrin when they said, see, we have heard the blasphemy. He must be executed. Jesus let it stand. Why? Because that's what he meant. Jesus meant that he was God. We see this a lot in the Gospel of John, where Jesus claims to be God by saying, I am. But it happened in the Gospel of Mark first. Now, a funny thing, when we fast forward about 10 years, because Mark's Gospel was written in about the year 70 A.D., when we fast forward to about 80 A.D., Matthew, who had borrowed from Mark, took pretty much the same story, but he changed it just a little bit. Caiaphas asked Jesus if he were the Son of God, and Jesus said that he was the Son of God. And then Caiaphas tore his robes, and Jesus got executed. But where was the blasphemy here? Jesus didn't make his I am statement in the Gospel of Matthew. How is it that Jesus got executed if he didn't make that blasphemous statement? Well, it's because by the time Matthew was writing, Christianity had taken somewhat of a different turn. Mark was writing very much from a Jewish perspective. Matthew was writing more from a Christian perspective, which is ironic because Matthew generally takes a very Jewish perspective on what he's writing. But in this case, Mark was more authentic to the Jewish spirit. When Jesus claims to be the Son of God, for Mark, that just means that he's the Messiah. For Matthew, it means that he comes from God, that he's related to God, that he is God. The theology of Jesus as God has developed since Mark, and you no longer have to say, I am, to be associated with God. Now, saying that you're the Son of God has a different meaning, and it associates you very, very closely with God. It always kind of bothered me, like, why is it that in Matthew's gospel there's no statement of blasphemy, and yet he gets charged with blasphemy anyway? It's because the definitions have changed. Well, that brings us to the end of our story for today. Next time on Theology Quip Notes, we're going to consider the place of homosexuality in the church. It's somewhat contentious at times, it's painful, and we need to sift through a little bit of that pain. We need to find a place of understanding. And so, next time, the much-needed topic of the place of homosexuality in the Catholic Church will be our topic. For now, we end. This is Ray Hurdle with Theology Quip Notes for St. Luke Catholic Church.